Mark Thompson had been planning this surprise for 3 weeks. His wife Sarah's birthday was coming up, and he wanted to do something special. They had been married for 8 years, and lately their relationship felt like it was running on autopilot. Work, bills, daily routines. It seemed like they barely talked about anything meaningful anymore. Sarah worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts that often left her exhausted. Mark ran a small accounting firm downtown, and his days were filled with numbers and deadlines. They were both good people, hard-working and devoted to their responsibilities, but somewhere along the way, they had stopped being devoted to each other. The idea came to Mark during his lunch break on a Tuesday. He was eating a sandwich at his desk when he remembered how Sarah used to love dancing. Before they got married, they would go to this little jazz club downtown every Friday night. Sarah would light up when the music started, and they would dance until closing time. She had this beautiful laugh that would ring out over the music, and Mark would feel like the luckiest man alive. When was the last time he had heard that laugh? Mark couldn't remember, and that realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. He put down his sandwich and started planning right there at his desk. He would recreate their first date, but this time in their own home. He would hire a jazz band, transform their living room into a dance floor, and surprise Sarah when she came home from work. Mark spent the next 3 weeks secretly organizing everything. He found a local jazz trio that specialized in the same kind of music they used to dance to. He arranged for flowers to be delivered, ordered Sarah's favorite wine, and even bought a new dress that he thought she would love. He had to be careful about the timing because Sarah's work schedule was unpredictable, but he managed to confirm that she would be home by 7 on Friday evening. The band members were professional and understanding about the surprise element. They agreed to set up quietly in the afternoon and wait for Mark's signal. Mark even practiced dancing in his office after hours, trying to remember the steps they used to know by heart. His secretary caught him once and gave him a strange look, but Mark just smiled and kept moving to the imaginary music. As the day approached, Mark felt more excited than he had in years. He imagined Sarah's face when she walked through the door and heard the music. He pictured her eyes lighting up the way they used to, and maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The surprise wasn't just about Sarah's birthday. It was about saving their marriage. On Thursday night, Mark could barely sleep. He kept going over the plan in his head, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. The musicians would arrive at 4. The flowers would be delivered at 5. He would change into his best suit and wait for Sarah to come home. It was going to be perfect. Friday morning arrived with unusual brightness. Mark kissed Sarah goodbye as she left for her shift, and she seemed tired, but gave him a small smile. She had no idea what was waiting for her at home. Mark went to work but couldn't concentrate on anything. He kept checking his watch and counting down the hours until his surprise would unfold. At lunch, Mark received a text from the band leader confirming they would arrive on schedule. Everything was falling into place exactly as he had planned. Mark left work early, claiming he had a dentist appointment, and rushed home to make sure everything was ready. The house had never looked better, and Mark felt proud of what he had accomplished. By 6:30, everything was perfect. The musicians were in position, the lights were dimmed, and the atmosphere felt magical. Mark stood by the window, watching for Sarah's car. His heart was beating fast with anticipation. This was going to change everything for them. This was going to bring back the love and joy they had somehow lost along the way. At exactly 7:15, Mark saw Sarah's car turn into their driveway. He gave the signal to the band, and soft jazz music began to fill the house. Mark positioned himself near the front door, ready to see the surprise and delight on his wife's face. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times over the past 3 weeks. The key turned in the lock, and Mark's heart raced with excitement. This was it, the moment that would bring them back together. The front door opened slowly, and Mark held his breath. But instead of Sarah walking through alone, she was laughing softly with someone behind her. Mark's smile began to fade as he realized she wasn't alone. A man's voice drifted through the entryway, low and intimate in a way that made Mark's stomach drop. "I can't believe how late we are," Sarah was saying, and her voice had a lightness to it that Mark hadn't heard in months. "I hope Mark isn't home yet. He's been working such long hours lately." Mark stood frozen in the living room as the jazz trio continued playing their romantic melody. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, trying to surprise his wife with romance, while she was apparently having her own romantic moment with someone else. Through the archway, Mark could see Sarah's silhouette, but he couldn't make out the man with her clearly. They were standing close together, and Mark could hear the rustle of clothing and whispered words he couldn't quite catch. His heart was pounding now, but not with excitement, with a growing sense of dread and confusion. "Sarah?" Mark called, out, his voice cracking slightly. The whispering stopped immediately, and he heard Sarah gasp. "Mark? What are you doing home so early?" Sarah's voice was higher now, strained. The man with her said something Mark couldn't hear, and there was a moment of awkward silence broken only by the saxophone playing in the background. Mark took a step toward the entryway, and the band, sensing something was wrong, began to play more quietly. "I wanted to surprise you," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "For your birthday." Sarah appeared in the archway alone, looking flushed and slightly disheveled. Her hair was messier than it usually was after work, and her lipstick was smudged. She looked around the living room, taking in the flowers, the dimmed lights, and the musicians, with an expression Mark couldn't read. "Oh, Mark," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like guilt. This is beautiful. You did all this for me?" Before Mark could answer, the man from the entryway stepped into view. Mark's world tilted slightly as he recognized Dr. James Crawford, Sarah's colleague from the hospital. He was still wearing his scrubs, and his dark hair looked like someone had run their fingers through it. Mark had met him a few times at hospital functions, and Sarah had mentioned him occasionally in her stories about work. "I should go," Dr. Crawford said quietly, not meeting Mark's eyes. He looked at Sarah with an expression that confirmed Mark's worst fears. "I'll call you later." Sarah nodded without looking at either man, and Dr. Crawford headed toward the door. Mark heard it close softly behind him, leaving him alone with his wife and the jazz trio, who were now playing so quietly they might as well have stopped altogether. "Sarah," Mark said, and he was surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "What's going on?" Sarah finally looked directly at him, and Mark could see tears forming in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft music that now seemed completely inappropriate for the moment. "I can explain," Sarah finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked around the room again, taking in all of Mark's careful preparations. "Mark, I had no idea you were planning this. If you had known what?" Mark asked. "You would have come home alone?" Sarah's face crumpled, and she sat down heavily on the couch. "It's not what you think," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, they both knew that wasn't true. Mark looked at his wife, really looked at her, and realized how long it had been since he had paid attention to the details. She had lost weight recently, and she was wearing makeup more often. She had been working later hours, and when she came home, she seemed distracted, always checking her phone. The signs had been there, but Mark had been too busy with his own life to notice them. Or maybe he had noticed, but chosen not to see them. Either way, the surprise he had planned to save their marriage had instead revealed just how far gone it already was. The jazz trio finally stopped playing altogether, and the silence in the room became overwhelming. Mark could hear the tick of the clock on the mantel, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. "How long?" Mark asked quietly. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at him with something that might have been regret. "Mark, please, can we talk about this after?" She gestured toward the musicians, who were sitting uncomfortably in the corner, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Mark turned to the jazz trio, who had been sitting in awkward silence during the entire exchange. The saxophone player, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, gave Mark a sympathetic look that somehow made everything feel more real and more painful. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," Mark said, reaching for his wallet. "I need to pay you for your time, but I think the evening is over." The band leader shook his head. "Don't worry about payment, sir. We understand these things happen." He gestured to his bandmates, and they began quietly packing up their instruments. "We'll show ourselves out." Mark appreciated their discretion, but their kindness only made him feel worse. These strangers were treating his personal crisis with more grace than he felt capable of mustering himself. As they filed out through the front door, Mark found himself alone with Sarah in the living room that still smelled like the flowers he had ordered for her surprise. Sarah was still sitting on the couch, staring at her hands. The silence between them felt different now, heavier, more final. Mark sat down in his favorite chair across from her, the same chair where he used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings while Sarah made coffee in the kitchen. How many ordinary moments like that had they shared without realizing they were precious? 6 months, Sarah said suddenly without looking up. It started 6 months ago. Mark felt something cold settle in his chest. 6 months. That meant it had started right. Around the time they had talked about maybe trying to have a baby. He remembered that conversation now, how excited he had been, how Sarah had seemed hesitant but agreed they should try. Had she already been thinking about someone else even then? How? Mark asked, surprised that he wanted to know the details. Sarah finally looked at him and he could see that she had been crying. We were working late one night. There was this patient, a little girl who had been in an accident. She didn't make it, and James and I were both there when it happened. We went to get coffee afterward because neither of us wanted to go home yet. Mark could picture it clearly. Sarah always took the difficult cases hard, especially when children were involved. She would come home quiet and sad, and Mark would try to comfort her, but he had never really understood the weight of what she carried from her job. We just started talking, Sarah continued, about the case, about how hard it is to deal with loss, about life. He understood things about my work that I had never been able to explain to anyone else. You could have explained them to me, Mark said quietly. Sarah looked at him with something that might have been pity. Could I? Mark, when was the last time you asked me about my day and actually listened to the answer? The question hit Mark like a slap. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but as he thought about it, he realized Sarah was right. Somewhere along the way, their conversations had become functional exchanges of information. Who was picking up groceries, what bills needed to be paid, what time they needed to leave for various obligations. When had they stopped really talking? To each other? That doesn't justify this, Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, it doesn't, Sarah agreed. I know that. I've known it was wrong from the beginning, but Mark, I felt so lonely. Even when you were sitting right next. To me, I felt like I was living with a stranger. Mark wanted to be angry. He wanted to shout and demand answers and make Sarah feel as hurt and confused as he did, but instead he just felt tired. Bone deep, soul-crushing tired. So what now? He asked. Sarah was quiet for a long time before answering. I don't know, she said finally. James has been asking me to leave to start over with him. He's getting divorced, too. The casual way she mentioned Dr. Crawford's divorce made Mark realize how much of Sarah's life he had been missing. She had been living in a completely different world, making plans and having conversations and falling in love with someone else, while Mark had been going through the motions of their marriage without paying attention to any of it. "Do you love him?" Mark asked, and he was surprised to find that he genuinely wanted to know the answer. Sarah's face softened in a way Mark hadn't seen in years. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." The honesty of it was almost more painful than the betrayal itself. Mark had been hoping that this was just physical attraction or a temporary mistake, something they could work through with counseling and effort. But love was different. Love meant that Sarah had chosen Dr. Crawford not just physically, but emotionally. It meant that somewhere along the way, she had stopped choosing Mark. Mark looked around the living room, taking in all the details of his failed surprise. The flowers were still beautiful, the lighting was still romantic, and the wine was still chilling in the kitchen. He had put so much thought and effort into creating one perfect evening, but what Sarah had needed was for him to put that same thought and effort into their relationship every day. "I should have tried harder," Mark said, more to himself than to Sarah. "We both should have," Sarah replied. "But Mark, I think we're past that now. I think we've been past it for a while and neither of us wanted to admit it." Mark knew she was right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The marriage he had been trying to save with his surprise had already been over, and he had been the only one who didn't know it. The next few hours passed in a blur of painful honesty. Sarah and Mark talked more openly than they had in years, but it felt like performing surgery on a patient who was already gone. They dissected their marriage with the careful precision of two people who had finally accepted that it couldn't be saved. Sarah told Mark about the gradual way her feelings for Dr. Crawford had developed, how their coffee conversations had turned into long walks after difficult shifts, how she had started looking forward to work not because she loved her job, but because she would see him there, how guilty she had felt, and how she had tried to stop it from happening, but found herself unable to stay away. Mark listened to all of it, and somewhere in the middle of Sarah's explanations, he realized something surprising. He wasn't as angry as he thought he should be. Instead, he felt a strange kind of relief. The distance he had been feeling from Sarah, the sense that something was wrong but not knowing what, it all made sense now. "I think I knew," Mark said when Sarah finished talking. "Not consciously, but some part of me knew something had changed." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "You never said anything." "Neither did you," Mark pointed out. "We both just kept pretending everything was fine." It was true. They had both been living in a kind of willful blindness, going through the motions of their marriage while avoiding any conversation that might force them to acknowledge what was really happening. They had become experts at talking around their problems instead of addressing them directly. Mark got up and walked to the kitchen, needing to move and think. He opened the wine he had bought for their romantic evening and poured 2 glasses. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he needed something to do with his hands, and they both needed something to help them get through this conversation. When he returned to the living room, Sarah had moved to the window and was staring out at their front yard. The house across the street belonged to an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who had been married for over 50 years. Mark used to wonder what their secret was, how they had managed to stay together for so long when so many other couples fell apart. "Do you remember when we first moved in here?" Mark asked, handing Sarah a glass of wine. "You said you wanted to grow old in this house like the Hendersons." Sarah took the wine but didn't drink it. "I remember," she said softly. "I meant it when I said it." "So did I," Mark replied. "What happened to us, Sarah? When did we stop fighting for each other?" Sarah was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think it happened gradually," she said finally. "We got comfortable, and then we got lazy, and then we got distant. And once we were distant, it became easier to stay that way than to figure out how to get close again." Mark knew she was right. Their marriage had died not from any dramatic betrayal or major conflict, but from 1,000 small neglects. Every conversation they didn't have, every evening they spent in the same room without really connecting, every time they chose television, or work or sleep over spending time together. It had all added up to a relationship that existed only on paper. "I'm sorry," Sarah said suddenly. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. You deserved better than finding out like this." Mark looked at his wife, soon to be his ex-wife, and felt a complicated mixture of sadness and gratitude. "I'm sorry too," he said, "for not paying attention, for letting us drift apart, for not being the husband you needed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking wine and processing the end of their 8-year marriage. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across their living room. Mark thought about all the evenings they had spent in this same room, watching television or reading books, existing parallel to each other but not really together. "What happens now?" Sarah asked eventually. Mark had been thinking about the same question. "I guess we figure out how to get divorced," he said. "We sell the house, divide everything up, start over." The practical aspects of ending a marriage felt overwhelming, but Mark was surprised to find that he wasn't dreading them as much as he might have expected. Maybe it was because he had finally accepted that their relationship was over, or maybe it was because the alternative, continuing to live in a marriage where both of them were unhappy, seemed worse than the uncertainty of starting over. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight," Sarah said. "Tomorrow I can start looking for an apartment." Mark nodded. "Take your time. There's no rush." He meant it. Despite everything, he didn't want to make this any harder on Sarah than it already was. She had found someone who made her happy. And Mark realized that he wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with him. "Mark?" Sarah said as she stood to leave the room. "Thank you for tonight, for the surprise. It was beautiful, and I know you put a lot of thought into it." "I wish." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I know," Mark said. "Me too." After Sarah went upstairs, Mark sat alone in the living room surrounded by the remnants of his failed romantic gesture. The flowers still smelled sweet. The wine was still good, and the mood lighting still created a lovely atmosphere. All the elements for a perfect evening were there, but the most important ingredient, a marriage worth saving, had been missing. The following weeks passed in a strange blur of normalcy and chaos. Mark and Sarah continued living in the same house while they figured out the logistics of separating their lives, but they moved around each other like polite strangers. Sarah found a small apartment across town, and Mark helped her move her things without any dramatic fights or tearful scenes. They handled their divorce with the same careful politeness they had brought to the end of their marriage. Mark threw himself into work, staying at the office until late and taking on new clients to keep his mind busy. But in the quiet moments, usually late at night when he was alone in the house that felt too big for one person, he found himself thinking not about Sarah or Dr. Crawford, but about his own life and what he wanted it to look like going forward. The surprise evening that had revealed the end of his marriage had also revealed something else. Mark had lost touch with who he was outside of his role as Sarah's husband. He couldn't remember the last time he had done something just because it interested him, or spent time with friends, or pursued any kind of hobby or passion. He had been sleepwalking through his own life for years. 3 months after Sarah moved out, Mark was having lunch alone at a downtown cafe when he noticed a familiar face at a nearby table. It was Elena Martinez, a woman he had known in college but hadn't seen in over a decade. She was sitting alone, reading a book and sipping coffee, and when she looked up and caught his eye, her face lit up with recognition. "Mark Thompson?" she said, standing up and walking over to his table. "I can't believe it's you." Elena looked different than she had in college, older, obviously, but also more confident and sophisticated. Her dark hair was shorter now, and she was wearing a professional-looking dress that suggested she had done well for herself. But her smile was exactly the same as Mark remembered. "Elena," Mark said, standing to give her a hug. "What are you doing in town?" "I moved back about 6 months ago," Elena explained. "I got a job at the museum as the new exhibitions coordinator. What about you? Do you still live here?" Mark found himself telling Elena about his accounting firm, about Sarah, about the divorce that was almost finalized. He hadn't intended to share so much personal information, but Elena was easy to talk to, and Mark realized how much he had missed having real conversations with people who weren't clients or colleagues. Elena listened without judgment, and when Mark finished his summary of the past few years, she nodded thoughtfully. "Divorce is tough," she said. "I went through one about 5 years ago. It felt like the end of the world at the time, but looking back, it was actually the beginning of a much better life." They talked for over an hour, and Mark found himself laughing more than he had in months. Elena told him about her travels, her work at the museum, her 2 cats who had completely taken over her apartment. She was funny and interesting and passionate about her career in a way that reminded Mark of how people could be when they were truly engaged with their lives. When Elena had to leave for a meeting, she gave Mark her business card. "We should get coffee sometime," she said. "It would be nice to catch up more." Mark watched her walk away and realized something important. He wasn't ready to date anyone, but he was ready to start living again. Elena's friendship, and it was friendship, nothing more complicated than that, reminded him that there was a whole world of experiences and connections he had been missing while he was focused on trying to save a marriage that was already over. That evening, Mark called his old college roommate, David, who lived about an hour away. They had kept in touch sporadically over the years, but Mark realized he hadn't made any real effort to maintain the friendship. David was surprised to hear from him, but immediately invited Mark to come visit the following weekend. Mark also started thinking about the things he used to enjoy before he got married. He had played guitar in college and had been pretty good at it, but his instruments had been gathering dust in the closet for years. He had enjoyed hiking and camping, but Sarah had never been interested in outdoor activities, so Mark had gradually stopped doing them. On Saturday morning, Mark drove to a local music store and bought new strings for his guitar. The young man behind the counter was enthusiastic about music and ended up talking to Mark for 30 minutes about different playing techniques and local venues where amateur musicians could perform. Mark left the store feeling excited about something for the first time in longer than he could remember. That evening, Mark sat in his living room, the same room where his marriage had ended, and played guitar for 2 hours straight. His fingers were out of practice and his calluses had disappeared, but the music felt like coming home to himself. He played songs he remembered from college, songs from his youth, and even tried to write a few simple melodies of his own. As he played, Mark thought about the evening 3 months ago when he had tried to surprise Sarah. The irony was that his marriage ending had turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to him, even though it hadn't felt that way at the time. He had been trying so hard to hold on to something that was already gone that he hadn't realized he was also holding himself back from discovering who he could become. Mark looked around his living room and started making mental notes about changes he wanted to make. Different furniture, maybe some artwork on the walls, definitely a better sound system for music. For the first time since Sarah left, the house felt like it belonged to him instead of feeling like a museum dedicated to their failed marriage. 1 year later, Mark was setting up for another surprise, but this time it was different. He was organizing a small concert in his backyard for his friends, featuring several local musicians he had met through the music store. Mark had been playing with them informally for months, and they had decided to put together an evening of music to celebrate the arrival of spring. Mark's house looked completely different than it had during his marriage. The furniture was more comfortable and reflected his personal taste rather than compromise choices. The walls displayed photographs from his hiking trips and camping adventures, along with some artwork by local artists he had discovered at Elena's museum exhibitions. The house felt alive in a way it never had before. Elena arrived early to help with the preparations, carrying a box of pastries from her favorite bakery. Their friendship had deepened over the past year, and while there was definitely an attraction between them, they had both agreed to take things slowly. Mark was still learning how to be single, and Elena respected his need to rediscover himself before getting seriously involved with anyone. "This looks amazing," Elena said, surveying the backyard setup. Mark had strung lights between the trees and set up chairs in a semicircle around a small stage area. "I can't believe how much you've changed in just 1 year," Mark smiled as he adjusted one of the microphone stands. "I can't believe how much I needed to change," he said. "I spent so many years thinking that being married meant I was living a complete life. But I was actually living about half a life." David arrived with his wife and teenage daughter, followed by several other friends Mark had reconnected with over the past year. The group included people from college, neighbors he had never really gotten to know while he was married, and new friends from his hiking group and music circle. Looking around at all these people, Mark realized he had built a community for himself in a way he never had before. The music started as the sun began to set, and Mark felt the same excitement he had experienced a year ago when he was planning Sarah's surprise. But this time, the feeling was entirely positive. He wasn't trying to save something that was broken or recreate something that was lost. Instead, he was celebrating something new and genuine that he had built from scratch. Mark played 3 songs during the concert, including one he had written himself about starting over. His voice was stronger than it had been in college, and his guitar playing had improved significantly over the past year. But more than the technical improvements, there was an authenticity to his performance that came from finally being comfortable with who he was. After the concert, as people were mingling and enjoying the food and drinks, Mark found himself standing next to the spot where he had waited for Sarah a year ago. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It just felt like something that had happened to someone else in a different lifetime. Elena joined him, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Last year," Mark said. "I was standing right here waiting to surprise Sarah, thinking that one romantic evening was going to fix everything that was wrong with our marriage." "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "The way everything happened?" Mark considered the question carefully. "I regret that we let our marriage deteriorate so badly before addressing it," he said. "I regret that we hurt each other. But I don't regret that it ended. If it hadn't, I would never have discovered any of this." He gestured toward the people laughing and talking in his backyard, toward the life he had built for himself. Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be exactly what we needed," she said. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Mark felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what happiness felt like, not the desperate attempt to hold on to something that was slipping away, but the quiet satisfaction of building something solid and real. Mark had learned that surprises weren't about grand gestures or perfect moments. Real surprise came from discovering capabilities within himself that he had never known existed. The biggest surprise of all had been realizing that the end of his marriage wasn't a failure to be ashamed of, but a necessary step toward becoming the person he was meant to be. 6 months later, Mark received a wedding invitation from Sarah and Dr. Crawford. He was genuinely happy for them, and he sent a generous gift along with his regrets that he couldn't attend due to a camping trip he had planned. The camping trip wasn't actually scheduled for that weekend, but Mark felt that some boundaries were important to maintain. Mark kept the invitation on his refrigerator for a while as a reminder of how far he had come. The man who had planned a desperate surprise to save his marriage seemed like a different person entirely from the man who was building a life based on authentic connections and personal growth. He had wanted to surprise his wife, and what he had walked into had indeed changed everything, just not in the way he had expected. Sometimes the best surprises were the ones life gave you when you were brave enough to let go of what wasn't working and open yourself up to what could be.